Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. It is exactly 8:39 a.m. This is News and Views with me, Julie Ali, on Salam Media. Now, it seems like there's going to be more bad news in the future regarding the price of petrol, crude oil, gas, and everything else that goes with it, because we understand that the price cap on Russian seaborne oil agreed upon by the EU, the G7, and Australia has come into force. But Moscow says it will not abide by the price cap, even if it has to cut oil production. And that's where I say it seems like we're going to be paying much, much more for all of these commodities come the new year. Let's speak with Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at Institute for a Global Dialogue, and have get his insights into this very, very important issue. Ashraf Patel, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program, and nice having you on air today.
Walaikum salam, Julie. Hope you and listeners are all well.
Alhamdulillah. Am I correct in being concerned about this issue? Very concerned, might I add?
I would say moderately concerned. The issue of oil and gas and energy has always been at the center of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So it's not surprising as the conflict moves into a new stage that different kinds of economic mechanisms and tools will be applied by the West against Russia. Many analysts are reading it to be a kind of mainly a tool to try and change behavior or to relax the invasion or components of the invasion. So whether it will work or not is the jury is still out. But what it does mean is, as you correctly state, that energy prices, especially for the consumer, is likely to be on an upward trend.
Okay, so obviously, Ashraf, as you've also indicated, it's a way of almost taming Russia, for want of a better word. Is the West hoping that if they introduce this energy cap and if Russia does comply, Russia won't have the resources, monetary and otherwise, to continue its war into the Ukraine? Is that behind all of this strategy?
It does seem that behavioral change seems to be part of the strategy, but Russia is different from other countries in the global south in that it is a regional and global power. It is one of the largest energy exporters. It's a member of the G20, as well as BRICS, as well as the UN Security Council. So it does have high-level power, as well as good partnerships with strategic nations, for instance, China. Now, that will mean it does have countervailing power, more so within OPEC. So that would be where the real contestations will take place. In so far, Russia has managed to strike very good relationships with key OPEC members, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran and Venezuela. So I don't think it would have a large impact on Russia, although it will signal some kind of move. There are moves and momentum to get the parties around the table. So that may be the play in the background.
Ashraf, because the world's key shipping and insurance firms are based in G7 countries, this cap could make it difficult for Moscow to sell its oil for a higher price. And I should also imagine that countries that don't adopt the measure can continue to buy Russian oil above the price cap. But here's the rider. But without using Western services to acquire, insure, or transport the gas or the oil that they're getting from Russia. So that does come at a risk, does it not?
Yes. definitely the West has these sophisticated financial tools, and they may deploy that in this case. But remember, Russia has been very adept. Russia, Iran, over the years, they have been very agile in terms of bypassing a lot of the formal sanctions. Already, Russia and China are developing an alternative payment system for global trade. So, what the unintended effect of this would be essentially uh, BRICS nations and other nations would create alternative systems of trade and payment and maybe even trade insurance. So, in fact, it may have a negative unintended consequences for the G7. The more they try and push powerful nations like Russia and China into a corner, these nations have the capability and capacity to develop alternative systems. So you will recall during the Trump era, President Trump banned Huawei from many Western technology platforms, and all Huawei did was it created deflating systems and bypassed that. So I think this is a similar case in the energy markets, and therefore I think the EU may have made an error on this one. It will be contained, and Russia will gain more partners in the OPEC community and in the broader global south.
Okay, so what about us being part of BRICS? Let's assume this does go ahead. EU stands its ground very, very firmly, and we know that Russia won't back down. Are we protected? Will we still get oil? Will we still get oil and gas at a reasonable price, being part of BRICS?
Well, South Africa is integrated in the global trade and financial markets, and therefore we will pay the market rate. We're not leveraging our partnership with BRICS under the current administration, and therefore we may lose on some of the concessions. It's a very complicated world. It's very contested, but South Africa is a very small player. We have not invested in the critical infrastructure in the last few years. We've not invested in refineries, and therefore the problem is our own, not necessarily the global market.
Okay, to quote Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, Alexander Novak, he has said that this move by the West was a gross interference that contradicted the rules of free trade and would destabilize global energy markets by triggering a shortage of supply. We also know that Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and they are standing quite firm. They say that they will not accept the price cap and would not sell oil that is subject to the price cap. They're very firm regarding the stance of theirs.
Yes, that's not surprising. They do have the convening power, and they have a presence in OPEC and very sophisticated foreign policy in the Middle East. So the EU needs to up its game. Unfortunately for the EU, they're entering a very cold winter, and by playing these kind of grandstanding politics, they're just going to make it worse for their own citizens. Whereas they should have been engaging Russia more on equal terms, and try and resolve the conflict. And essentially, the kernel of the conflict, besides the NATO expansion issue, the kernel of the conflict is sanctions. And I think if the West can readjust their policy on sanctions to make it more fair, it may avoid many conflicts now and in the future, because the world is moving toward the multipolar world. And if you look at sanctions, for instance, against Iran for 30 years, it has not worked. People have suffered, yes, but the political aims have not been achieved. So a new kind of system is needed, one that's rooted in global multilateralism, fairer terms of trade, more fair political power distribution, and all these issues need to be debated in the forums like the G20, etc. Unfortunately, with the capitalist system in many kinds of crises, they need to capitalize on markets and for profitability. So if you do a stakeholder analysis, the biggest beneficiaries of the war is primarily the OPEC countries because of the oil, and secondly, the large multinational oil companies, especially Exxon, Shell, BP, etc. They are
Mm-hmm.
sitting with profits of $100 billion net each. And so they have gained and consumers have lost. So it's a very unequal situation. We're not sure in whose interest, for instance, the West is acting. So if they want to cap Russian oil, by default, they want to promote their own multinational corporations' profitability. So there are lots of kind of agendas, sub-themes that are at play. And unfortunately, smaller nations would get left behind. Poorer countries would get left behind. Africa suffers a lot because we don't have social safety nets. We don't have good employment. We don't have economic diversification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Africans and the poor in the world suffers the most, unfortunately.
Finally, Ashraf, we do know that Russia is a law unto itself. They could be tempted to create its own fleet of tankers operating and insuring them itself. However, Brussels believes that building a maritime ecosystem overnight will be very complicated. And as such, make do measures could have trouble convincing customers. They could go that route. And it is doable, is it not? Let's assume that scenario does play out. What would the situation look like as far as Russia's, you know, Russia situation in supplying oil to other countries apart from the European Union countries?
Look, shifting production, supply chains, these are very complicated. And you know the challenges with the chips,
Mm,
technological chips, for instance, China, etc. It's not an easy thing. The high cost structures needs lots of capabilities, and the cost gets passed on to the consumer. The EU is trying to find its own global foreign policy that is insulated both from the US and from Russia and China. So they're making a play in world affairs. They want to be their own kind of power separate from the US and the China Russia side. And so this is where this seems to be going. Unfortunately for the EU, they 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 don't have their own energy resources, so they're
mm,
dependent on their corporations for access to resources, especially in Africa and Latin America, and that has clashes with the environmental agenda. So many analysts point out to the double standards of the EU. They lead on climate change in COP27, but then they have not signed on the fossil fuel agreement, meaning that they are allowing the companies to explore for fossil fuels in Angola, in South Africa, in Namibia, in Mozambique. And that is clashing with the environmental agenda. And this is part of the broader narrative playing itself out in the world today. The balance between what kind of energy mix we need, what kind of economic structure we need, what kind of politics. And all of this, South Africa and smaller nations get caught up in the headwind. And we need very astute leadership.
mm-hmm,
Unfortunately, countries like South Africa don't have a solid national interest plan. Under the Ramaphosa administration, he's playing second fiddle mainly to the G7. He's doing all their dirty work in Africa. He runs
mm-hmm.
to the G7, but we get no concessions on trade, no concessions on energy. And therefore, as South Africans, we lose out. So this is the problem we have. We don't have integrated foreign and economic diplomacy that is for the national interest and for our citizens. We don't have leadership, unfortunately.
Finally, Ashraf, let's just focus very quickly, a short, sharp answer, if you don't mind, regarding the Russian Ukrainian war. I think all of us, everyone around the world, back in the day, well, when it just started, when that invasion just started. We thought it would last, it would be over within a few weeks. It's over 9 months that war on the Ukrainian people is still ongoing. What do you believe needs to happen to end the war? Who are the role players that could sit down with Putin and negotiate a settlement? We do know not too long ago Erdogan from Turkey had talks with Russia, trying to broker a peace deal. Where are we now regarding all of those peace deals and peace talks?
Very good question, Auntie Julie. Look, at the G20, there was lots of moves to solve the conflict. I think both Russia and the West are now open to talks, formal talks. President Erdogan seems to be a broker, and he is making a lot of progress, both publicly and behind the scenes. And Turkey will gain a lot from this. But the real power broker will be China, purely because China is one of the most powerful economies in the world, and has the most foreign currency, 2.3 trillion surplus. So all the nations, I mean, even President Biden met President Xi at the G20. The European foreign minister went to Beijing last week. The German chancellor went a few weeks ago. They all need to trade with China. Russia is a strategic partner to China, and probably would listen to the advice of China. So China would then emerge as playing that more strategic role to resolve the conflict, not directly, but through platforms like BRICS and the G20 to normalize relations. And I think with that too at play, as well as the EU now really ready for the talks, and President Biden signaling to meet President Putin, there may just be talks before the end of the year. Otherwise, it's going to be a very cold and hard winter, especially for Europeans, and very high expense, high energy inflation for the world.
That's where we leave it. Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Always a pleasure to hear your insights on all of these political issues. Until the next time, as always, you go well, and salaam alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam and shukran to you and listeners.
8:56 exactly, news and views on Salam Media. Please do stand by. In a minute or two, we are going to be talking with healthcare practitioner specializing as a social worker. That's Dr. Nazim Abrams. He runs a very successful rehab center in the west of Johannesburg. It is called Lighthouse on the Horizon. We're going to take a slightly different stance with him this morning. We're going to be talking about GBV issues during these 16 days of no violence against women and children, regarding GBV issues and the role men and boys play, and how they can be bigger, stronger, and better men and boys. So do stay with us at 8:57 a.m. on News and Views.